Good evening, everybody, and welcome, as Fiona said, to this year's festival, which is our second one online, though there are one or two, a very limited number of live events. Anyway, tonight what I'm going to discuss is the experiences of several Irish women who chose to go to Britain during the Second World War, or the emergency as was known in what's now the Republic. I'm going to quote from some of the women's contributions to an oral history project about the impact of the war, which focused particularly on women in Dublin and Belfast as the capital cities of the two Irish states. Now, I'm just going to move myself and everybody out of here so you can see the maps. Éire's neutrality, and this is era, as it was until the Republic was founded in the late 1940s. Because we had been neutral from the beginning of the war, it meant there was no governmental compulsion to persuade women to work outside the home, which had been the case in the belligerent countries. In fact, in Éire, women had been actively discouraged from working outside the home, especially throughout the 1930s. However, the war conditions in Britain created opportunities for Irish women to get jobs there and enabled some of them to fulfill ambitions or to develop personally in ways that wouldn't have been possible before the war started. Northern Ireland was exempt from conscription during World War II, although it was part of the United Kingdom. And efforts to recruit women there to war industries in the province or to join the armed forces were based on appeals to civic conscience or to self-interest, as illustrated by this extract, which was taken from a Ministry of Labour advertisement. In the hour of the country's need, the women of Ulster have always responded unselfishly and courageously to the call of service. The hour of need is upon us now. At a government training centre, you will be taught a trade essential to the war effort. You will be paid well during the training period of 4 months, and afterwards you will be placed in well-paid essential employment. Now, that was the carrot, or several of them. There were also a few sticks that were used, but I'm not going to go into it in detail tonight. Emigrants from Ireland seem to have moved primarily to Britain during the war years to better themselves economically. And this would have been the case before the war as well, in the interwar period. And the majority of men and women who were emigrating headed for employment in Britain's industrial areas. The women whom I interviewed about their wartime emigrant experiences indicate that family influence was a significant element in how they usually made decisions about their lives. But in regard to their decision to leave Ireland, with one exception, they had chosen to go to Britain themselves. As a means of monitoring emigration, passengers to Britain from Éire were required to obtain travel permits, and these were not issued to anyone who already had a job in Ireland or who had left their employment voluntarily. Restrictions were also placed on persons with skills that were considered essential for the economic and social needs of the Irish state. Intending emigrants had to apply for travel identity cards through the Garda Síochána. They had to supply a certificate from the Department of Social Welfare, which stated that they were exempt from immigration restrictions, and their application had to be accompanied by a written offer of employment in Britain. A number of regulations were introduced in the course of the summer and autumn of 1941, specifically to control the flow of emigration from Ireland, from Éire to Britain, including the requirement that anyone applying for a travel permit had to be over 22 years of age. The role of recruitment agents for British employers was curtailed at a later stage in the war, but not early on, because their overt activities had caused some public outcry, naturally enough, and the censor was instructed to ensure that no advertisements that offered employment outside the country appeared in the national press. Bizarrely, though, they had no regulations about those posters and ads appearing in the employment offices, which were run by the state. So from 1940 to 1945, Irish workers going to Britain were classified as what they called conditionally landed. This term implied that Irish workers, male and female, were excluded from conscription if they returned home after 2 years. When the British National Service Acts were passed in June 1939, men living in Britain for longer than 2 years were treated as permanent residents. And that's permanent in quotes, really, because it wasn't quite permanent. But after 2 years, they were liable for conscription. In practice, Irish emigrants to Britain throughout the course of the war were regarded as temporary, and therefore they weren't subject to conscription. There were other political reasons too why it wasn't thought desirable to enforce the rules. Presumably, persons who were resident in Britain for longer than 2 years prior to the outbreak of the war and who did not return were willing to take their chances as regards conscription. However, any Irish citizen living in Britain who was called up for service could return home, and in 1941 an assurance was given by the British authorities that this would remain the case. However, female emigration from Éire was supposedly strictly controlled and limited throughout the war years, at least according to the Department of External Affairs. So the Westminster government maintained records relating to wartime travel to and from Northern Ireland, and they didn't differentiate between Northern Irish passengers and those from the southern state. So it's therefore not possible to ascertain exact figures for Northern Irish women who emigrated during the war, although historian John Blake, who wrote the official history of the war in Northern Ireland, maintained that more than 7,500 Northern Irish women transferred to war work in mainland Britain, and he based his estimates on the figures obtained from the Ministry of Labour. He was given regular briefings while he was writing his history during the 1950s. So as employment opportunities decreased in the south, mainly due to the rationing of raw materials for industry, greater numbers of workers, both male and female, went to Northern Ireland and Britain to take advantage of the need for personnel to service the war industries. This table shows the number of passengers migrating from Éire to Britain by sex, showing the very high proportion of residents from Dublin in the total number of travellers. Dublin County Borough had the second highest rate of emigration at 72 per 1,000 in the years 1940 to 43, and this was surpassed only by Mayo. The large number of travellers from Dublin may have been because of easier access to transport, but is also likely to have been due to the greater impact of on industrial employment, which was caused by the wartime shortages of raw materials. Letty had worked in a sewing factory in Dublin since leaving school at 14, and she was one of the casualties of the shortage of raw materials. She applied for unemployment benefit, but the weekly payment rate was so low that she felt unable to manage on it. The Labour Exchange in Dublin offered her an alternative. I went with a couple of other girls I was working with. We were only in our 20s when we went. And we said, there's no sign of this war being over, so we'd better go and do something. You know, there was no work and you only had about 20 shillings a week coming off the labour. That was the money at the time. And you'd give that up to your mother, so you'd no money left. So I decided to sign up, and some others, you know, the way the word goes round, and they took our names, and so we were signed on. Letty and several of her friends were sent to a munitions factory in Reading. They were accommodated in a hostel, which she described as being extremely comfortable with every convenience. She was happy enough with the job she was given, even though it was quite dangerous. It involved packing explosive into shells. Letty didn't remember any of her fellow workers complaining, in contrast to the experience of an assistant welfare officer who was responsible for helping Irish women settle into a factory in Aston near Birmingham, which was the subject of a mass observation investigation in July 1942. And if you're not aware of mass observation, it was an organisation that had been started in the late 30s and was based largely on letters and surveys and reports carried out by so-called ordinary people who commented on how life was progressing during the war. They lasted for years after that, but the war was a particularly important part of their work. So this woman said, so much of my work is smoothing the girls down when they first come. They're not told that it's heavy, dirty work when they're in Ireland. It's left to me to deal with smoothing that down at this end. And this is a quote from a woman who was interviewed by Dorothy Sheridan, and whose story appeared in this anthology, which I strongly recommend. Now, not everybody, as I said, there was one exception to the number of people who chose to go themselves. Frances was sent to Britain because her mother had decided that her daughter was very badly behaved and needed discipline. So the mother answered an advertisement in one of the Catholic newspapers looking for domestic help. And she arranged to send Frances to Birmingham to work in a convent school, despite her young age. Frances hadn't expected to be staying on in school herself, but she'd never thought of leaving Dublin until her mother sent her away. You can see here, Frances was sent in September of 1941, and these are just some of the horrific remains of Birmingham city centre after the Blitz there in April, which certainly wouldn't have been recovered from by the time she was going away on her own. Anyway, she said, I was 15 on the 1st of August and I came to England on the 1st of September, and I didn't even have to have a passport because I wasn't 16. My birth certificate was stamped at the emigration entry at Holyhead. The practice of sending young girls off by themselves was not confined to girls from Éire, according to the account of an independent unionist member of the Stormont Parliament. If I would tell you some of the heartrending tales I have of the plight of these girls in Liverpool and Manchester, it would make even cabinet ministers blush with shame. And that is no mean feat, because Stormont cabinet ministers have skins as tough as alligators. Once you get them on board the Liverpool boat, you don't care what happens to them. Some of them had to be befriended by Belfast men working in Liverpool. They were sent across the water without a farthing in their pockets, no different from cattle. And this was reported in the Irish press, but actually, you know, the Department of Foreign Affairs was just as lax about letting young Irish women. One of the things that the Stormont government was doing, though, to protect industry at home and having cheap labour available for it, they weren't very keen on young women being sent away, especially to for factory work, because they would have been paid better on the British mainland and were less likely to come back. But it wasn't, as I said, necessarily for concern for their safety. So Mr. Henderson there was horrified, but nothing really changed in the course of the next few years. In this memorandum written by J.P. Walsh, who was the Secretary General of the Department of Foreign Affairs, this is just a very small extract from it. He wrote, "We've had cases of Irish girls being sent back to this country, excuse me, by the British police on the ground that they were too young and immature to be away from home. The taking of employment in Britain by young girls of 18 or 19 may be justifiable on other grounds, but it is certainly not good for the girls themselves, and in many cases it is very humiliating for the country." Now, the concern with the country's reputation really seems to have been paramount. This is a much longer, as I said, memorandum. It's 2 full pages, and mostly what is bothering Mr. Walsh is that it's not looking good, because there was a lot of discussion in the British newspapers, prompted by some of the charities that were working in Britain, including the Catholic Social Welfare Bureau and various other religious bodies that were looking after these girls when they turned up, often penniless and with no connections to help them through. The only money Frances had with her was 5 shillings that her father had given her, and when he told her much later in life he had obtained by breaking open the gas meter in the family home. There's no fairly clear who ruled the roost in that family. But despite the repeatedly expressed alarm concerning the moral dangers for female emigrants, the Irish states, neither Northern Ireland or Éire, were giving state aid or municipal grant to the various charitable bureaus, no matter how much they were called upon to assist in that regard. So during the First World War, the British government had exerted draconian control over the labour force, and this had led to considerable resentment and unrest. In the Second World War, the Labour Party in Britain joined the National Coalition government led by Winston Churchill. They joined in May 1940. The Minister for Labour, let me see here, Ernest Bevan, and he was the Minister for Labour and National Service. But he was also the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, which was the largest union in Britain. And he had come from a very poor working class background himself, so he had a good idea of what people were having to deal with, unlike most of the rest of Churchill's cabinet, who were from middle class and upper class backgrounds. So Bevan established a joint consultative committee of 7 employers' representatives and 7 trade unionists, and this was to advise the government on the conduct of the war effort on the home front, so that the kind of resentment that had arisen and the industrial problems that had arisen in the First World War were less likely to occur. But at the same time, it wasn't just a softly approach. An emergency power order under the Emergency Powers Act of 1939, the Essential Work General Provisions Order of 1941 was passed. And this allowed for the dilution of labour. In other words, you could bring in less skilled workers to replace skilled workers who were being moved wherever they were needed and wouldn't necessarily have a choice about it, assuming, of course, they hadn't already been conscripted into the armed forces. There was a lot of resentment of the impact of conscripted workers on skilled trades, including the deployment of women. I mean, men who had worked through an apprenticeship and had learned their skills and who had earned decent conditions because of the development of their skills over years, obviously resented women being brought in, and they called them devotees, just as they had been in the First World War. And of course, this reinforced the secondary status, not least in the matter of low pay that the women were paid relative to their male fellow workers. However, what was often glossed over, and which had been during the First World War, was that women workers who came in as substitutes for men who had been enlisted in the forces or who were elsewhere deployed generally did a very good job if they were given the training. There's just that quite often they were expected to come in with no background training and to take over jobs that men might have been doing for several years. But regardless of the unfairness and the problem of a lack of equal pay, excuse me, the employment situation in Britain was certainly better than it was in Éire or even Northern Ireland. And this was largely due to the extra opportunities created by the demands of war. Pay and conditions depended very much on the job that was being done, although even so-called traditional women's jobs, like domestic service, were generally better paid in England especially, so much so that the emigration rate during the war resulted in a shortage of domestic workers in Ireland. The table here gives a very general comparison between the wage rates and cost of living in Ireland and the United Kingdom or Britain between 1939 and 1945. The figures from the Westminster Labour Ministry included the wage rates and cost of living index for Northern Ireland, so it's not separately set out there. Nursing was considered to be an appropriate and acceptable profession for women to enter and didn't cause any of these arguments. It combined the traditionally female skills of caring and nurturing. In wartime, it also allowed women to get close to the action without arousing any misgivings about their suitability as combatants. Entry to nursing training in Ireland had to be paid for by the applicants or their families. And this forced many women in Ireland, both north and south, to go to Britain for training. There was a shortage of trainee nurses in Britain from the late 1930s onwards, and young Irish women were welcomed. Nancy's parents had sent her to a secretarial college when she finished her secondary education, but she didn't want to pursue a career in administration. The head of her secretarial college suggested that Nancy should apply to the Selly Oak Hospital in Birmingham, and in the summer of 1943 she was accepted there as a student nurse. Nancy was paid from the beginning of her nursing training, as well as getting full board and lodging. She said it would be more or less pocket money because, you see, we had 3 meals a day, we had full board and lodging, you know, bedding, the whole lot, plus our education, plus everything else. I think it was £3 something a month that I got when I first started, which obviously doesn't sound like much now, but would have been a decent wage for a young woman in training at that point. Nancy thought her conditions were particularly good because the city of Birmingham funded the hospital at Selly Oak where she was doing her training, and nurses who were training in voluntary hospitals would not have been as well off. The Rushcliffe Committee on the Pay of Nurses for England and Wales undertook a major review of salaries and conditions in 1940 and 1941. This is following representations from a variety of organisations concerned about the huge discrepancies in pay rates for nursing staff in different areas of the health service, particularly between public and private institutions. When Olive completed her nursing training in Dublin, she got engaged to be married. But because of the couple's financial position, they couldn't afford to buy a home, and they decided to wait for a year or two before the wedding. If she got married straight away, because of the marriage bar on public hospital nurses at the time, the only work available to her would have been to go into private nursing, which didn't appeal to her. She decided to go to England where she could get further specialist training. So she said, I went off to England to an RAF hospital to do plastic surgery down in Sussex. And I had a great time there for a year and a half. I'm sure that may have been slightly blocked, but they had all these RAF pilots who'd been terribly badly burned and wonderful plastic surgery. At that time, there was no plastic surgery in Ireland. It was a very exciting place after the parochialism of the Irish hospital. And you see Sir Archibald McIndoe here, who the men were called the guinea pigs because the hospital was famous for not just the restorative plastic surgery that they were doing, but the incredible medical innovations they were coming up with to save men who had come back from horrific burns, as Olive said, who might have had difficulty being accepted back into society after their ordeal. Olive was nervous when she left in the first place, but she soon discovered that the training she'd been given in the Irish hospital, however parochial she thought it, was more than adequate for the demands of her new job, and this boosted her self-confidence. The hospital had originally been cottage hospital before the war, but after the Battle of Britain, there was so much need for a specialist burns unit that was expanded on a very large scale. Archibald McIndoe was a New Zealander and he ran the hospital, but the American and Canadian governments had also contributed new wards, and this further emphasized the cosmopolitan nature of the operation. Olive was chastened by the numbers of men who were still in need of the major surgical treatment that was being developed in the hospital, even as late as 1946 and 47. Mita was already in England when the war started. She travelled from Northern Ireland to Liverpool in 1937 to help her older sister, who had recently given birth. While visiting her sister in hospital, she met some student nurses and became interested in their work. She was frank about her reasons, which not only included the fact that she would have board and lodging at no cost to herself, but she would also be working with a nice sort of person. She and her sister were conscious of the sort of people they mixed with. Mita's concern about the social background of her colleagues was not exceptional, either among the interviewees that I spoke to or in general. Niceness was a desirable quality, frequently alluded to in women's magazines at the time, and seems to have had little to do with income or class and was frequently linked with respectability. By the time Mita qualified as a nurse, the war had started, but she decided to remain in England and took her training in midwifery, which would enable her to do more specialised nursing and increase her employment prospects. She was planning to get married, and she found that restricted the range of opportunities that would be open to her. No one would employ a nurse getting married, especially one marrying a soldier. Someone suggested to her to try the Civil Nursing Reserve. Following an interview with the Chief Medical Officer of Lancashire County Council, Mita was given a choice of two positions. She could run a first aid post in Manchester or a sick bay for evacuated children in Blackpool. She chose the latter because the thought of working in Manchester with the bombs falling around her was not very appealing. Now, staff shortages during the war could create promotion opportunities, as well as giving somebody like Mita additional responsibility. Shortly after she started work at the Evacuation Center, she got a call in the middle of the night from the county hall to deal with a staffing problem. The matron was being dismissed after what Mita described as an episode with an older assistant nurse. She then went on to say that she'd never heard of lesbianism before, so one can kind of speculate about what the episode was. Anyway, Mita was placed in charge, barely out of training. Excuse me. And she was given responsibility also for looking after the funding. So that was paying the non-nursing staff who came from the local village to clean the house, do the cooking and care for the grounds of what was a large house in the country. The Evacuation Center dealt with children from poorer homes because, as Mita pointed out, the more affluent ones were usually evacuated privately, and some were even sent to America. Many of the children had impetigo, scabies, and suffered from enuresis, for which they were given treatment in the evenings. The bedwetting meant that someone had to be up during the night to take the children to the bathroom. So the staff tended to work long hours, although they did have a break if the children were attending classes. None of the children were under 5, and they could be aged up to 12 or 13. Parents could have access to their children if they were able to visit the area, but often the children had been evacuated on their own. Mita said, "I often think now of all those little children marched down to the railway station with just a label on them, and it must have been terrible for the mothers to part with them, not knowing where they were going to." Now, the children here look quite cheerful, but I would imagine when they realised that they were going to be away for as many as a few years, it must have changed how they felt. More than 3 million people were evacuated from British cities in the first 4 days of September 1939 alone, and most of those were school children who were separated from their parents. Another aspect of the long days related to queuing for goods in the shops, and this seemed to be an integral part of the rationing system in Britain. And for women who were working outside the home, it could make significant inroads into what little spare time they had. Kathleen had got married in Portstewart to an English soldier she met through her work in the Women's Volunteer Service. She worked in the canteen. When he was posted to Europe, she went to England to live with his family. The Irish women who travelled from both sides of the border were usually single and childless and had not been particularly interested in childcare arrangements. Or as far as Kathleen could remember, there had not been a creche in the Slough factory or the factory in Maidenhead where she had worked making aircraft parts. She just thought that women with children had left them with family members or had worked part-time shifts that coincided with the children's school hours. At a conference of the Standing Joint Committee of Working Women's Organisations on the provision of nurseries in wartime, which was held in February 1942, a resolution was passed declaring that the care and supervision of the children of employed mothers was a national responsibility, and protesting against a Ministry of Health circular that had been sent to local authorities in the previous December, suggesting that most of the children must be cared for by means of private arrangements made by the mothers. The conference described the suggestion as an attempt to evade promises previously made by the government that the children of mothers volunteering for war work would be properly looked after. There really were some incredible levels of hypocrisy going on, forcing women out, but not taking any kind of, making any provision for their other responsibilities. However, in addition to the educational and financial incentives that had persuaded some Irish women to travel to Britain in wartime, some motives related to the war itself and the forces involved in it, as Ethel explained. Although she lived in Dublin, her family considered themselves to be British and had a tradition of joining the armed forces. Ethel was determined to go. She said, "I just said to my mother, I'm going to join up." She said, "Don't be silly, nobody would expect you to do that." Being the youngest, I was very demanding, and I suppose I was used to arguing. But for once, I just kept quiet, and I thought, I'll be 21 in February, and there's nothing they could do to stop me. So I waited until I got over my 21st birthday, and I got the day off, and I never told the family I was going to Belfast. I just came back and said I've joined the WAF. This was the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And she did say that at a later point, once she was in the uniform and doing very responsible work, that her mother credited her and Monty with the successful way the war was going in the later years. Her family followed the progress of the war on the radio, listening to broadcasts from the BBC, because Radio Éireann, of course, was prohibited from referring to the war under the Emergency Powers Act, which established the parameters for Éireann's neutrality. Ethel was one of the first women to be trained as an electrician, working first on Whitley and Wellington aircraft and later on Spitfires, and eventually she was promoted to leading aircraft woman. She seems to have had quite a talent for maths that came out in her interview, and but she did encounter a fair amount of prejudice on the basis of her gender. Research into the status of women in belligerent Western states during the Second World War found that the potentially liberating aspects of the war situation for women were offset by the extra work that was generated for them, by the expectation that they should continue to fulfill their traditional domestic function in addition to taking up war work. Although the question of equal pay was raised, considering that many women were taking on jobs that had previously been done by men, it was only in the United States that the principle was conceded. And even then, individual employers frequently ignored the government's recommendation on the issue. No fundamental changes in women's public status resulted from their involvement in war work, although in the long term, their emergence into the workplace in large numbers contributed to the undermining of institutional gender-based discrimination. The Irish women whose stories I have quoted had a choice about whether to travel to Britain or not, but for most of them, the reasons for going were a consequence of a lack of other choices that were in turn related to a combination of their family's economic circumstances and the women's gender. The women who had been made redundant in Éire because of the wartime conditions certainly appreciated being able to earn decent wages at a time of hardship at home. Others were grateful for the opportunity to avail of access to professional training that they couldn't get in Ireland, or even just the chance to spread their wings for a while. Looking back on their time in Britain during the Second World War, they recalled it as being synonymous with adventure and independence, which they remembered with a sense of accomplishment and pleasure. Now, I've only had time this evening to refer to the experiences of a very small number of women, even within the small group that I interviewed for the project. There were 35 in all. But these women represent the many others who also shattered the gendered stereotypes like the one in this illustration, which I have to say was not intended to be humorous. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, Fiona will help you with those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Brilliant, as always, very interesting. As Mary said, if you have any questions, you can pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We have one question here, Mary, already. Do travel permit application records survive? This lady's grandmother was one of those who travelled, but it was to train as a nurse. And she said it was in 1941 when she was aged 18.
They do, maybe not all of them by any means. Professor Jennifer Redmond in Maynooth has done great work on researching the travel permits and where women went and what they were going for. And she'd know a great deal more about the detail than I would. But my contact details we can put up at the end or something, and I can pass on a query if she wants to see if was her great grandmother or grandmother?
Her grandmother.
Her grandmother. If she can trace her. I haven't actually seen them myself, and because I haven't had permission, that's why I blacked out the personal details of the person whose card I used.
Okay. Yeah, the person can email the Central Library and I can pass it on.
If you can pass it on, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's centrallibrary@dublincity.ie if anybody wants to do that. Let's see, did the Catholic Church not object to Anglo-Irish women going over to Protestant England, as it would have been known at the time?
Well, this is the thing about the Catholic Social Welfare Bureau was English-based, and they were English Catholics who were trying to look after young Irish women. And there were continuous debates in the Irish newspapers through the 1930s about this. But it was all putting the blame on the young women. As usual, there wasn't really any practical discussion about why they might be leaving. I mean, it was a time of extreme poverty for a lot of families, and especially young women. So the chance of maybe getting training or better money over the sea was very tempting. But also, of course, there were problems about young women who had got pregnant. And as we now know, the levels of hypocrisy about that were fairly extraordinary. So really, there was a lot going on, but in terms of discussion, but not a lot happening in terms of actually helping out.
See, did these Irish women tap into existing Irish networks in London and bigger cities?
Sometimes they did, but sometimes that was quite hard to do. I mean, for instance, Frances' story is pretty awful, being sent off at that young age. She, as I said, had only 5 shillings in her pocket, and she arrived in Birmingham city centre not even knowing where the convent was. So she went into a police station, and there was a gentleman there who was a gentleman, thankfully for her sake, who helped her find the convent, delivered it to the door. But when she got to the door of the convent, he said, "I don't think I should be seen with you here." And she had later experiences with the nuns they're keeping her away from men, so they probably would have misunderstood the relationship. But if it hadn't been for that man, she could have still been wandering around, because the police had so many other things on their mind at the time. They weren't inclined to be taking stray Irish girls to convent schools.
Another person asks wonder if many of the women who travelled to England to train and work actually came back to Ireland later.
Some did. I mean, as I said, I interviewed 35 women for this project, and of those, I think it was 4 stayed. They weren't all doing the same work, and 1 or 2 travelled elsewhere afterwards. One didn't come back until she retired. She'd worked for the UN for a while. That was Nancy, and she had a very adventurous career. She came back to Ireland in her late 60s. So, but for the most part, they did come back, and, they settled down. They nearly all got married, which was the expectation of them at the time. And some of them had never really talked about their experience very much. Others, it would have been maybe a daughter or a female relative who suggested that I talk to whoever it was.
Yeah.
In the north, I mean, I've often said this, but when I did the interviews in the north, in Belfast especially, and in Dublin, if I removed all of the place names and the actual names, you wouldn't know which district you were talking about. Okay. The experiences were very similar.
All right. Somebody else has asked, what was the reaction to these women if and when they returned to the country after the war?
Well, the only one that I would have expected to have a story about maybe a hostile reaction would have been Ethel, who had actually joined the armed forces. But she said when she was on leave, she wore her uniform and she never had the slightest bother. She lived in Glasnevin, and there was no bother at all.
Okay. Somebody else, hi from America. Can you explain what the Department Ministry of External Affairs is and how it is different from Foreign Affairs?
It was the forerunner of Foreign Affairs. Yeah. I don't quite know what the reasoning was behind calling it external. It sounds like, the era was the center of the universe and everything was external to it. But various departments that existed in those days have changed, have had different names. I mean, there wasn't even a Department of Health at that stage. There was Department of Local Government, included health. So there were a lot of increases in the numbers of civil servants who were working, but also variations in the responsibilities that they would have had.
Okay. My mother went to London aged 11 with her elder adult sister. It appears that accompanied children did not need a travel permit.
No, and Frances should, strictly speaking, have been accompanied because she counted as a child. There was an assumption that if a child was accompanied, that they were safe. I mean, one of my other interviewees had actually been born in England, had come back to live with her Irish relatives when the war started because her parents evacuated her to here. But as soon as she turned 18, she went back to Britain to enlist.
Okay.
But the age that the cutoff was supposedly 18, but External Affairs were saying 22. That was never the case.
Yeah. Did you need to have a job offer before you would have been granted a travel visa? Yeah. Did work opportunities change at home in Ireland for women?
They changed for the worse in Ireland during the emergency, because especially in the south, because although we hadn't great manufacturing industry, we had some, especially around the cities, and then the raw materials weren't coming in. So women would have been hit first and hardest by the reduction in employment in jobs. But in the long run, really in the 50s, women were in fairly dire straits, that it wouldn't have counted for anything that you went to Britain and had gained a lot of experience, maybe as a nurse or whatever. Some of the women who had trained as nurses still had some difficulty in getting jobs because they got married. So, which I always thought was bizarre, that if somebody has got married, they're still well capable of doing their job.
Were Irish girls generally made feel welcome?
Yes and no. Again, it sort of depends. In Pat, who I didn't talk about, but she was in the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and she was working in various RAF bases as a secretary. And she was known as Paddy for all the years she was there, although she had been born in England. So that level of kind of, it's harmless, but others did have problems. But then Nancy said in Birmingham in Selly Oak Hospital, there was a group who kept complaining to matron that they were being discriminated against because they were Irish Catholics. But it turned out is because matron wouldn't change their rosters so they could go to Mass every Sunday. Whereas Protestant girls weren't asking to go to church every Sunday. They just, so Nancy thought this was nonsense, and she was glad that the matron hadn't given in to them. So she said basically they were creating their own problems.
Are the interviews with the women available online or anywhere else?
The transcripts are available through Maynooth University and in if you're a student in Trinity, you can read them, but they're in the library. But Maynooth have them. Right now I'm having a senior moment and I can't remember the name of the website, but it is, it's a website that's devoted to uploading projects that are based on oral history. And I didn't give them the recordings because the women at that stage hadn't given me permission to do that. And they weren't very keen on their voices being heard, but they were okay about the transcripts being given, and then they went into a book, the extracts, but the full transcripts are available online.
Okay. Has there been any research into any similar experiences of women working in England during World War One?
Well, World War II or World War One? Oh, sorry, yeah. Some, but the problem, I suppose, was that you wouldn't get anyone to do an oral history interview about who had lived through World War I because they'd be just gone. There are similar projects that were carried out, but researching through other means rather. Fionnuala Walsh in UCD has done a lot of work on women in World War I, Irish women. I did more from the point of view of where women working in specific industries during those years rather than, going away to work. But my own grandmother went to work in a munitions factory in, I think it was Birmingham during the First World War. But she left almost immediately because she didn't like the rough women that she had to work with. And she went to work for Finlaters instead, which was obviously considered to be a respectable job.
Somebody else said my husband's aunt worked in one of the munitions factories, but had to come home after a while because she said she got sick because of the work she was doing. And do we know whether there might be any records of these factories?
There are some records. Right now, again, probably if somebody could email you and give me specifics of where because some of the factories kept good records, others didn't. But also there was a problem that the work the women did was generally forgotten about. It wasn't really written very much until, I'd say, about the last 10, 15 years. So I couldn't say for sure if the records would be there for the specific factories, but there are some. But a lot of women got sick, not just the Irish women, because they were putting phosphorus into bombs and it turned the skin yellow and it did all sorts of things. And it's only really in later years that researchers started to look at the health effects of working in those environments, what they would have been.
Were the Irish women well regarded by the Irish people in general for having served in the war?
I actually think it'd be hard to say yes or no because it wasn't advertised. They wouldn't, and they generally wouldn't have boasted about it. But I always think of Cathal O'Shannon's story. He joined the RAF. For very principled reasons. He wanted to fight fascism. And some of the women would have had political ideas like that. I mean, Ethel considered herself British, but she did want to fight the Nazis, or at least to do something in the fight against them. But they weren't credited. I mean, De Valera and the government were so determinedly neutral that he sent, condolences when Hitler killed himself. And there were later instances then, with various Nazi spies and that who had almost state funerals here because there was that edgy kind of very old, I don't want to say Republican because that's far too broad a description, but that idea that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. So there were still, the likes of Frank Ryan, for instance, who had gone to Berlin and various others. But as far as women were concerned, it didn't really come up.
Hello from Manchester. I wonder if you could recommend any books on Ireland during the Second World War. I found the lecture incredible and would love to look into this more. So I suppose where would people go to find out more?
Well, unfortunately, you can't have access to the Irish library system, but I can put together a list that would be available more generally. I mean, there's my own book on the subject, unfortunately, is out of print. Hint, hint, Irish Academic Press, we're coming up to the end of the war. But there are some excellent books on the subject, and especially, about women's role. And from the point of view of Northern Ireland as well as down south.
Okay. Somebody else asked if there'd be a recording of the lecture. There will be. It will be on YouTube at, I'm not sure when, but the Festival of History will probably see that on their website shortly after. Did the girls from the north of Ireland mix well with the girls from the south?
I haven't been told of any instances where they didn't. That's all I can say. It's a broad question, but it probably depended on where they had come from in the first place. But that's kind of putting more recent thinking to sectarian divides than might have been the case. And the Stormont government did put a fair amount of pressure on certain groups of women to go to England to get them off the dole. It wasn't, the poverty would have been fairly heavy, but at the same time, they had this competing thing that Northern Ireland was trying to develop war industries. They wanted to have munitions factories and others. So they didn't want the more skilled young women being exported as they saw it. So there's a lot of competing presentations coming from different aspects of industry, and also the fact that there weren't proper reception facilities for them. That a lot of what was done to look out for them, as Henderson said, was people in the local network picking up. Maybe somebody would write and say, "We've got this young girl coming over, could you look out for it?" That kind of thing.
Yeah. For the women who learned the skills of welding, engineering work, etc., did many get work with these skills when the war was over?
No. I mean, basically, no. All of the women in the First World War and the Second World War who substituted, diluted men's work were promptly let go at the end of the war. What the only exception, and it's not, it wasn't so much that kind of skill, but in the railway industry in Britain, where women had started to be able to be guards and things like that, they were able to stay on, but they never got to be drivers because that was very much a promotional job. And here it hadn't applied in the first place.
Let me see now. I think we're through all the questions. It's really amazing, Mary, when you look at the situation today with the Irish Regiment drawing men from north and south in the British Army.
Yeah, it's past time. I have to say, being anti-military myself, I'd prefer to see them cooperating on other things. But yeah, I think, anything that leaves the hatreds and the divisions of the past behind should be welcomed.
A lady said it didn't do my husband's aunt much harm because she was 104 when she died.
Wow, so phosphorus for old age.
Are there records of Irish women in the ATS?
Oh yes, yeah. There is a book that's devoted to the history of the ATS. Now, it wouldn't be specifically about Irish women, but it does give quite a lot of information about the conditions that women encountered. Because there's a hilarious series of debates in Westminster, which at least I found them hilarious when I was reading through them, and about whether women's uniforms should have trousers. Because it was unwomanly, but also, you know, they might be working on barrage balloons. And of course, for the anti-aircraft guns, a lot of women were allowed to pull the trigger if there were planes going overhead. And that was very important during the various blitzes that occurred. But so I can't imagine that skirts were the most practical kind of clothes, but this has been done for months. Yeah, it seems remarkably trivial thing to be engaged with in the middle, you know, when there were
so much more space.
Yeah, there was so much really to be faced with.
And somebody else said they viewed a programme on the Irish in British Regiment, and to see the portrait of Michael Collins hanging in the mess was really lovely.
Right. Well, I said what I think about military, and so you know that would be my opinion. I'm not keen on armies.
I think that's all the questions there.
Okay, well, if the people who had specific questions about individuals want to email you, and you can pass them on.
Yes, it's the Central Library at dublincity.ie.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll leave it there for tonight. I would like to thank our speaker, obviously Dr. Mary Muldowney, and everyone who took part and asked questions in today's Dublin Festival of History event run by Dublin City Council. I'd like to thank Kate and Ruth as well in the background for their technical support this evening. You can find out about other upcoming festival events at dublinfestivalofhistory.ie and on all our social media channels. So I hope you enjoyed today's event and that we'll see you at more events during the festival. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Fiona. Good night, everyone.
Goodbye.